So these days, in a world of calendar congestion, contracts, sponsorship and big TV deals, non-championship racing has pretty much died a death. You don't see drivers, when they've got a little bit of downtime, getting together at some obscure racetrack and doing a race, simply for the fun of it. One of the more famous non-championship series was the Tasman Series. This championship was essentially the Australasian Formula 1 season, and was when the top racing drivers and the teams of the time headed down under for a series so they could earn some big money and put on a show for the people down there, because an Australian Grand Prix as a round of the World Championship wasn't a thing at this point, and wouldn't be until at least the mid-1980s. The Tasman Series wasn't run exactly to Formula 1 regulations. The engines were actually larger than what Formula 1 permitted between 1964, so the first year it was run, and 1966. 1966 being the year the 3-litre formula was introduced, but in 1970 they allowed the F5000 engine rules, which allowed anything up to 5 litres to be run. What it meant was, any obsolete Formula 1 cars, or just racing cars in general so long as they were open wheelers, could run in this series. The series was typically run during the European winter, sometimes in between the first round of the season at Kyalami and the first round of the European season, which was typically Monaco or Zandvoort. With the South African Grand Prix sometimes happening on New Year's Day or around the start of January, it left the team sitting around not doing much, so they needed to do something to fill the 3 or 4 month gap in between races, and the Tasman Series would fill that gap nicely. Between 1964 and 1970, the grid was essentially a who's who of European motor racing, as a lot of the big names of the time, some of the greatest of all time, would be found in this series. Bruce McLaren, Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, Chris Amon, Jack Brabham, Frank Gardner, Denny Hulme, Piers Courage, Graham Hill, Pedro Rodriguez and Phil Hill were on the grid at some point or another, along with the rest of the grid made up of have-a-go heroes and up-and-comers. Leo Gagan, a long-time runner in the Australian Touring Car Championship, is on several entry lists, along with Bob Jane. But by the early 1970s, things had dropped off massively, because most of the big guns were no longer turning up. Long story short, it was getting too expensive to run down there. On top of this, the Formula 1 teams were now running sponsors all over their cars, and those sponsors would have been nudging them towards Formula 1 and Formula 1 only, either through lack of potential return on investment and sponsor deals limiting them to just one series, so the likes of Lotus and names like Jackie Stewart stopped returning. It also didn't help that in most cases, the reason that some of those drivers weren't returning was because of serious injury and or death. Clark, Rindt, Courage, Hill and McLaren being some of those drivers. Jack Brabham retired in 1970 and Stewart retired in 1973. Non-championship rounds still continued to be held. There was the annual Race of Champions at Brands Hatch that often saw big names from Formula 1 turn up, and in some cases with these older photos that I'm putting into these videos, if there's a picture from Brands Hatch, there's a chance that it's from the Race of Champions, rather than the actual British Grand Prix. With shorter race calendars and things like that in those days, there was the opportunity to fill the gaps with these one-off races. But as was the case with the Tasman Series, the costs were going up, and in some cases teams weren't willing to risk trashing a car or getting a driver injured or killed. The last ever non-championship race was the 1983 Race of Champions. On the grid for that race was a small collection of drivers. Just 13 drivers, as it so happens. Rosberg, Arnoux, Jones, Watson, Guerrero, Sullivan, Henton, Mansell, Boesel, Raback, Serra, Johansson and Schlesser made up the tiny grid, and the race itself was won by Keke Rosberg. And only 7 drivers finished this race. Non-championship races after this were abandoned due to things like the Concorde Agreement and escalating costs, especially with the turbo era about to hit full tilt with the rising engine power outputs. Saying that, Honda had tested a turbo engine with the Spirit team, with Murray Walker on commentary claiming it had done thousands of miles of problem-free testing, only for it to blow up after just 4 laps. But there was going to be some kind of replacement for these non-championship races, and it came towards the end of the 80s, and it kind of functioned like a mini Tasman Series, or actually more like a World Cup of drivers. Hear me out here. Group B ended in tragic circumstances in 1986. The deaths of several spectators and then the death of Henry Toivonen led to FIA President Jean-Marie Balestre banning the category at the end of that year, ending one of rally's golden eras. The other golden era being the time around the late 90s, early 2000s, just before the Sebastians started winning everything. But either way, Rally had lost one of its stars, and the end of the Group B era meant that the cars were mostly going to be museum pieces, never to set foot on a racetrack again. Unless that is you count the Group B Metros that ran as a support race to the Birmingham Super Prix back in the day. 2 years after the death of Toivonen, and to celebrate 10 years of the World Rally Championship being formed, the drivers who had won a championship in that time period, so 1979 to 1988, decided to put on an event that would determine who would be the champion of champions. So, over a single rally stage and using several different cars, these 8 World Rally Champions entered this event to see who was the best of the best, and it included the names of Walter Röhrl, Stig Blomqvist and Juha Kankkunen, and the way it worked was pretty damn cool. So firstly, the drivers went out in a BMW M3 to set a time that accounted for nothing other than to set the running order. Reverse order, slowest to fastest. So the slowest guy went out first, the fastest went out last. They went out again in a Sierra RS Cosworth and set a time, with the times being posted as they would be on an official WRC stage. Blomqvist took the top spot by half a second from Salonen, with Kankkunen in third. After this, they went out again, this time in an Opel Manta. At the end of the second qualifying round, Walter Röhrl finished fastest, just ahead of Salonen and Kankkunen. The Stig was fourth, followed by Biasion, hope I got that right, Valdegaard, Vatanen and Mikkola. After the second stage in the Mantas, the times of the drivers were put together to create an aggregate time, much like the qualifying sessions from the early part of 2005 in Formula 1, or like a 2-stage rally. The top 4 went through, and the bottom 4 were eliminated. Salonen, Kankkunen, Blomqvist and Röhrl went through, with Biasion, Vatanen, Valdegaard and Mikkola knocked out. The semi-final was done in an Audi Quattro, with the 2 Finns finishing first and second. Kankkunen just pipping Salonen, and they were about 3 seconds faster than Röhrl in third, while Blomqvist was nowhere near the top 2, which then led into the final, where they would once again use different cars. First, they used a 2:05 T16, where Kankkunen set the fastest time by about 2 seconds, but in the second final heat, they used a Lancia Delta Integrale, and Salonen won by about half a second. Add the times together, and Kankkunen was the champion of champions by about 1.2 seconds. It's also the only time that this event used this format. The following year, more events were added to allow those who had not won the championship to have a chance of racing the champions to see who the fastest drivers truly were. So it might be that a guy's really quick when they're all in the same car, but didn't have the fastest car over the course of the championship or things like that. But both those formats have since been binned, but the championship was still at its core, primarily, a rally championship. In 1999, the Nations Cup was introduced to allow non-rally drivers to compete in the competition, but the overall championship could still only be won by rally drivers. On top of this, the circuits that were used were gravel-based, so the rally drivers had a much bigger advantage over any of the circuit drivers and motorcycle racers that came to have a go. For the inaugural Nations Cup, countries had 3 drivers: a circuit racing driver, a rally driver, and a motorbikist, with those teams on your screen, with some of the drivers being drivers you might recognise. Danny Sullivan was supposed to be the racing driver for the All-Stars, but he was replaced by Harri Toivonen for this event. And given that it was still at its core a rally championship, Finland, unsurprisingly, won it. So how does it work then? Well, basically the races are held on a very tight and twisty rally super special stage. You might have seen these on rally compilation videos, as these stages were set up, I think, in the late 1990s to give the spectators something else to watch, and they could hold them in city centres and places like that. These kinds of things appear in Colin McRae Rally 2, and in Richard Burns' Rally some of these stages exist as well in the Rally Simfans mod. The cars race head to head on these tight tracks, and they work in such a way that you start on one side, you finish the first half of the race on the other side, and then when you finish the race at the end of like the second lap, if you want to call it that, you're back on the side you started on. To start with, the tracks were symmetrical, but now there's like an easy part and a more difficult part. But either way, whoever crosses the line first is the winner. In the Nations Cup and the actual Race of Champions, the final has a best 2 of 3 format. And from 2004, the whole format moved into stadiums so that everybody could see 100% of the track 100% of the time. And it was almost like a Colosseum type of thing. And it was brilliant. And this is where the rally drivers started leaving the event in droves. Basically, the switch to stadiums meant that the track was going to be tarmac and not gravel, so the rally drivers lost their advantage. But it in turn allowed for more circuit drivers, including Formula 1 drivers, to come in and have a go. All for a bit of fun at the end of the season and as something to do, and also as a bit of a show for the fans that had supported them all through the year. For the 2004 event, there was a rally driver and a racing driver for each nation. Casey Mears was a late substitute for Jeff Gordon, and there were 4 Formula 1 drivers on the grid. Sean Alesi, although he was ex-Formula 1 at this point, David Coulthard, Felipe Massa, and some bloke called Schumacher? Also in the event were Colin McRae, Marcus Grönholm, and Tony Kanaan, and TK was in the rally group for reasons. In the first round, Coulthard lost to a then unknown Heikki Kovalainen, and Kovalainen went into the semi-finals to go against Alesi. Bourdais beat Kenny Breck while Schumacher beat Massa to the surprise of nobody. Kovalainen then beat Alesi while Schumacher beat Bourdais to go into the final, where Schumacher should have convincingly beat Kovalainen, right? Right? Kovalainen beat Schumacher by a second, while Michael was then hit with a 10-second penalty for some reason, but Kovalainen won the racing car side of things. Sebastian Loeb won the rally side of things because, well, of course he did, but then when they put the racing driver against the rally driver, Kovalainen beat Sebastian Loeb. Kovalainen is the best racing driver of all time, confirmed. But hold that thought, because in 2008 something happened at the Race of Champions that was basically the racing equivalent of the XO beating the F2 Freestylers at the Wembley Cup. The 2008 event was held in London at Wembley Stadium, and by this point the event had evolved to have quite the stacked entry list. The Drivers' Cup alone had Schumacher, Tom Christensen, Jaime Alguersuari, who was just an 18-year-old at this point, Jenson Button, Tanner Faust, David Coulthard, Gareth McHale, Andy Priaulx, Jason Plato, Matthias Ekstrom, Adam Carroll, Sebastian Loeb, Ivan Muller, Sebastian Vettel and Troy Bayliss entering the round of 16. Stacked. Schumacher beat Christensen, which must have been the race of the round given the success that both drivers have had. 7 Formula 1 world titles and 9 Le Mans wins. That's an incredibly stacked race, and I might have to watch it once I'm done with all of this. Elsewhere though, Alguersuari was beaten by an American called Carl Edwards. So this set up a meeting between a 7-time Formula 1 world champion, 5-time Monaco Grand Prix winner and 91-time Grand Prix winner, and Carl Edwards. A man who never won his series, and at the point of this happening, he'd finished second in the NASCAR Cup. To put a long story short, everybody, and I mean everybody, was expecting Schumacher to absolutely smash this dude who could only turn left, and was running in a sport that stood for non-athletic sports centred around rednecks. Even the commentators on Eurosport, who should have been more professional than they were being, were thinking this entire round would be academic, and they'd see everybody in a couple of minutes when Schumacher crossed the line ahead of Mr. Can't Turn Right. And Schumacher was taking this race seriously. They were going to be doing this race in a Fiat 500 Abarth, so a front-wheel drive little hatchback thing that's commonly found in tight congested cities, and he was trying to get some heat into the tyres by sort of driving forward, slamming on the brakes, reversing and constantly doing it over and over and over again, much to the amusement of the official that was standing in front of him. The race got underway and there wasn't much enthusiasm from the crowd or from the commentators. The commentators had already picked Schumacher to win, and they were making these veiled jabs at Edwards about not having banking or having to handle corners because he's so used to ovals. But it became evident into the race within the first sort of 10 or 15 seconds that this race might be closer than people might have thought. And the commentators were saying, well, Michael must have made a mistake or something like that. Edwards had a 1.5 second lead by the time they'd got round to the split marker, the start-finish line basically, where the cars will have swapped sides thanks to the layout. But Schumacher would now have the easier part of the layout and should have caught up by this point, right? Right? No. Edwards won by 1.7 seconds. I find the whole thing entertaining for 2 main reasons. Firstly, F1 snobs coping in the comments whenever the footage is shared, and secondly, you've got the NASCAR fans who share the footage on the 14th of December every year without fail because it's the anniversary of the day that F1 snobs got humbled by a NASCAR driver, and also the day that one of the greatest of all time in Formula 1 got beaten by a NASCAR driver. But the whole thing, it's just, well, it's a nothing thing. Schumacher straight up admitted that Edwards beat him fair and square, and then in the next round, Edwards was beaten by David Coulthard. Germany actually ended up winning the Nations Cup that year, and they ended up winning it 6 times in a row with Schumacher and Vettel pairing up. But on the individual side, it's interesting to see how many different winners there are. But it's just a bit of fun. It's an entertainment showcase more than anything else. An international friendly that also showcases how adaptable the drivers can be, because they use different vehicles over the course of the event to try and catch drivers out. It's down to adaptability in some cases, but I guess it depends on who your guy is and how desperate you want to point score against other drivers. In 2015, Sebastian Vettel and Nico Hülkenberg lost to Andy Priaulx and Jason Plato, 2 domestic touring car drivers, but it doesn't mean anything. The Race of Champions is something fun at the end of the year. It gives fans an opportunity to see drivers that wouldn't necessarily race each other, and it gives those who do race each other on a regular basis a chance to compete on a more equal level, in the same car. It's like the F1 star in a reasonably priced car segment from Top Gear. It's just a bit of fun, a bit of bragging rights, nothing more. But it would be cool to see every F1 driver in something like this for a winner-takes-all type of thing, but it probably won't happen. And if it did happen, then this driver would have won because his car had better tyres, or there was more rubber on the track when this driver did his run, that sort of thing, as people cope over their driver not winning. But in a world now where racing is so damn expensive and drivers and teams are locked into contracts and other bits and pieces, then it means that the days of the Tasman Series are long gone. There aren't that many opportunities in the real world of racing for all the drivers to get together, hang out, and race for nothing more than, well, a bit of fun. And after some on and off years, the Race of Champions will be back in 2025 in Sydney, although the list of drivers doesn't seem to be as stacked as it was in the latter part of the first decade of the 2000s. Jamie Whincup will be interesting to watch, as will Bottas, Vettel and Mick, but I think it's something that will need some bigger names to try and improve the standing of it. But like I said, it's just a bit of fun and nothing to be taken super seriously, unless it's your guy that's winning, obviously. But at the same time, it is so good to see everybody in the same car, because it does show who the naturally fast drivers are. So then, a look at the history of the Race of Champions series that's held at the end of almost every year. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this, hit the subscribe button and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks, as ever, go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks down there if you just want to do a one and done donation that will go towards topping up my coffee cup. And there's also memberships there if you want to do Patreon without the whole Patreon thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.